summon your own friendly familiar in this episode of BattleGUIDES, featuring Lesandra, the Battle Summoner. Contrary to what her archetype might say, Lesandra is actually one resilient character who's slow, has a lot of stun guard, and deals a lot of damage. With a lot of range in her hands, it's really tough for a majority of opponents to handle a good Lesandra player. However, Lesandra does have some pet peeves in the fact that she's somewhat slow, most of her effects need the use of a familiar, and she has some minimum ranges on certain cards. Lesandra's unique ability is Battle Familiar. Lesandra has 5 familiars that all have a while active effect and an anti-effect. Now the while active effect, well, is applied to whatever attack she has as long as the familiar is active, and during the anti-phase, she may choose to banish her current familiar, putting it with her inactive familiars to gain its anti-effect for that beat. At the end of each beat, as an end of beat effect, Lesandra may choose to summon one of her inactive familiars. Now she can do this in one of 2 ways. Number 1, if she's dealt damage to the opponent that's equal to or greater than the familiar summoning cost, she may summon that familiar. The second way is that she may spend life equal to that familiar summoning cost. And at the end of all of that, you have to know that she starts with Borneo as her active familiar. As an added note, Lesandra can't summon the same familiar that she antied in a beat. One key thing about Lesandra's unique ability is knowing how to manage your familiars. Knowing when to keep your familiar, knowing when to anti your familiar for a new one, learning when to get new familiars, and learning how to deal enough damage to get your familiars for free. However, I think it's more important that we look at her familiars specifically. Let's start off with the default one, which is Borneo. Now, Borneo's while active effect is that Lesandra wins priority ties, which may or may not be good because Lesandra is technically a really slow player. Now, the anti-effect states that when you try to summon a familiar at the end of this beat, they all cost 1 less. And this is really good because it can spell the difference between summoning a really strong familiar for the situation or a really lackluster one. Now, the second familiar, which costs 2, is the Wyvern. The Wyvern's while active effect is that attacks at range 4 cannot hit Lesandra. Now, this is really good, especially at long ranges, but remember that it only works for range 4, not range 5, not range 6. Its anti-effect gives Lesandra before activating effect, which states that Lesandra can move directly to any space. Now, since Lessandra's usually slow, this isn't really meant as a means of getting into range for your stunning attacks, though you can use it that way. Usually I use this to get better positioning for the next beat or close gaps and deal damage. The third familiar, which costs 3 life, is the Salamander. Its while active effect gives Lesandra power +1 and ignores soak, making her trade really good. On the other hand, its anti-effect gives Lesandra power +2, ignores soak, and ignores stun guard, meaning that this attack doesn't only trade, but you can use it against slower opponents and stun them almost all the time, as long as you hit. The fourth familiar, which costs 4 life, is the Rune Knight. Its while active effect is simple, giving Lesandra stun guard 3, which means that a majority of her attacks will have the magic stun guard 3, making her nearly unstunnable. Couple that in with the majority of her styles having stun guard, and Lesandra almost never gets stunned. Its anti-effect, on the other hand, gives Lesandra soak 2, which makes her trade even better than before. Finally, the last familiar, which costs 5 life, is the Raven Knight. Its while active effect basically states that after activating, opponents lose 1 life, or the nearest opponent loses 1 life. Now, this might not sound like a lot, but it basically means that every beat, Lesandra technically deals 1 damage to her opponent. Its anti, on the other hand, gives Lesandra priority +4, meaning that the naturally slow Lesandra suddenly becomes extremely fast and hard to deal with for a majority of opponents. This serves as a great tempo familiar, and I really suggest antiing it at the right times or just turtling with it whenever you want. Let's start off with Invocation. Invocation is simple. It has awkward range, slow priority, and a lot of power. Typical for a Lesandra style. You basically don't want to take a lot of damage. So this card is very great used against weak attacks like Grasp. On the other hand, it's also good at range because not a lot of attacks deal a lot of damage at range. Now, in terms of bases, I highly suggest using this with Shot for maximum coverage or Grasp for more stun guard and more damage. Now, when it comes to familiars, Invocation goes really well with Wyvern so you can dodge attacks. Window is a fast style with a passive effect that states that if you have an active familiar, you get plus 0 to 3 range, which means that this card is amazing if you have a familiar active. However, do realize that Lesandra has a lot of range, so she doesn't really need to pull quite often. But when she does need the pull, she has it. In terms of attacks, again, Strike goes really well with this because it doesn't have any of the range, or Grasp because it's fast and has range, which Grasp really likes. When it comes to familiars, I highly suggest using Wyvern or Rune Knight if you're planning to keep a familiar active while using this card. Simply because these two familiars are the only ones whose effects matter before on hit. Because remember, this card makes you sacrifice a familiar. Next is one of my favorite Lesandra styles, Binding. It has a lot of range, is slow, and has stun guard. Typical of a Lesandra style. Its passive effect though is what makes it one of the best things ever. Note that the passive synergizes well with the built-in stun guard, allowing Lesandra to tank almost anything if the opponent moves a lot. Note that this passive only applies per activation, not per space move. So if your opponent moved 2 spaces, that's still only -1 power and -1 life. Now, in terms of attacks, I pair this attack often with Shot for a full board attack. Or if I'm feeling really risky, I try using Burst so that I can dodge the opponent's attack, and if he does try to drive, he will get less power. Now, when it comes to familiars, this attack goes really well with Rune Knight to supplement the stun guard, or Salamander if you want to make trades even better. Next up is Pact Breaker. Pact Breaker just basically has good stats, but no range. And the passive states that Lesandra can't hit unless she antis a familiar, which basically means that this attack is very limited in terms of hit confirm, but really good in terms of speed and power. This serves as your big cash out style. I want to deal all the damage. So now when it comes to bases to use with this attack, Drive and Summons are my favorite things to do. When it comes to familiars, you don't usually keep them, obviously. You have to anti them. And I suggest either anti-ing the Raven Knight or the Salamander because those two either increase your speed or increase your power overall. When I'm using Drive, that's usually with the Salamander anti, and when I'm using Summons, that's usually with the Raven Knight anti. Guardian has range, high power, low speed, and stun guard. Basically, typical of a Lesandra style. It gives you stun guard too if you have a familiar, and its end of beat effect basically reduces the cost of all of your familiars by the amount of damage you take in a beat, which means that if you trade with your opponent, it's going to be, well, easy summonings for you. When it comes to bases, Guardian also goes really well with Shot if you don't plan on using Rune Knight along with it. Guardian also goes very well with Drives, allowing Lesandra to close gaps and get more range out of this stat. Now, when it comes to familiars, I highly suggest Rune Knight to synergize with the built-in stun guard, or anti-a Borneo because it would make everything cost significantly less. And finally, we have Summons. Summons is Lesandra's unique base, and it has 1 range, 2 power, and 2 priority, which might not seem that good to many of you. But its start to beat effect is one of the scariest in the game because Lesandra can move the opponent directly into a space that's adjacent to her, effectively giving her ways of cornering opponents instantly without having to do anything. Now when it comes to attack pairs, I highly suggest pairing this with Guardian and Pact Breaker, though a lot of her other styles work with it equally well. Now when it comes to familiar usage, this base goes with the majority of your familiars except for the Wyvern because you pull the opponent adjacent to you. Lissandra's two overdrive finishers are Mazzaroth and Invoke Darkstalker. Mazzaroth is, well, an overdrive that doesn't hit. It has NA range, NA power, and 1 priority. But what does it do? At the start of the beat, Lesandra loses life until she only has 1 left. Then at the end of the beat, it basically says that after the next beat is done, Sandra wins immediately. So basically this is an instant win card that means you have to survive a few turns for it to work. Now, what's an effective way of using this card? Basically, bait your opponent's dash with this card, and then you dash the beat afterwards, and it results in an instant win. And their second overdrive finisher is Invoke Darkstalker. Invoke Darkstalker is a mid-range overdrive finisher that has mediocre power and decently high priority. Like the previous one, the start of beat effect makes Lesandra lose life until she only has 1. But she will gain power equal to the amount of life she lost. Then, on damage, Lesandra will heal equal to the amount of damage that she deals. This overdrive finisher is moderately fast, and your familiar antis and wild active effects still apply to this, meaning that it can be one deadly fast attack if you anti the Raven Knight with it. At best, this attack will deal 9 damage, healing you for 9 life, leaving you at 10 and your opponent 9 life less, which is really scary. Otherwise, be careful of bursts at range 2 or dashes. Now, what are some advanced Lesandra strategies? Well, I'd just like to refer to everybody to the Mikhail video, because basically that's what I'm going to be telling all of you now. You want to trade, and trade quite often. Because Lessandra's a generally slow character, anybody with average priority will outspeed her and damage her. But what does that basically mean? Basically, that means that Lesandra wants to deal more damage to her opponent, making Salamander one of the key familiars to her playstyle. But remember that it's not the only one. But on the other hand, always try to deal as much damage to your opponent as possible. Remember, if you deal enough damage to your opponent, you can summon familiars for free. And that is generally good, and generally what you want to be doing. Aside from that, remember that which familiars are going to be good for the next beat. Remember that just because the Raven Knight costs the most, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the one you need. Oftentimes, Salamander is what's most commonly used because Lesandra gets to deal more damage with it. But sometimes, you know, a Rune Knight might be useful for more defenses because it basically makes her nearly unstunnable. Or maybe a Wyvern so that you can close the gap. But oftentimes, Juto's just used so that you can summon something really fast the next turn. So that basically boils down to, well, familiar management. Managing your familiars is key when using Lesandra, and I mean key. Because you don't want to get stuck on a turn with a familiar you don't need. And at the same time, you don't want to anti a familiar at the wrong time because your opponent might make that useless. Then you have to spend so much life getting a familiar back. So know when to anti-familiars properly because getting them back might not seem like a big cost. It's just 3 life. But 3 life is still 3 life and any gap is terrible. So if you want to summon a familiar, note that you should always try to deal damage to your opponent. And being Lesandra, that's usually the case. But sometimes it's really hard to do that. And sometimes I highly suggest all of you to just sacrifice the life. Because sometimes you really need the familiar. Really, really need. As often as possible, try to always have a familiar up. Never have beats where you purposely don't have a familiar. It's rarely beneficial for you to do that, especially if the opponent gets a lot of bonuses because you suddenly have less stats or you don't have enough wild active abilities. So, in the case that you suddenly don't find yourself with a familiar, don't be afraid to spend the life. Even if Lesandra has so many tools that let her summon familiars, such as Salamander dealing more damage, Juto reducing the cost, Guardian letting you summon something for free if you take enough damage, Backbreaker and all of her other styles giving a lot of power pluses so that you can summon the more expensive ones because you hit your opponent for like 5 or like 4 damage almost every turn. Let's end with some combos. Now, combo number 1 is simple. It's Binding Grass. Binding Grass is basically near full board and lets you dodge opponents in melee. It's amazing. I don't really need to explain it more than that. Next up is Pack Breaker Summons. Pack Breaker Summons is never seen because it's technically also a full board range attack. But be careful of first. Anteing the Raven Knight is crucial when using this attack as it lets you deal a lot of damage really fast. And finally, Invocation Strike. Invocation Strike is one of my favorite attacks because it deals a ton of damage, especially if your opponent deals a weak attack at range. And that pretty much does it for this episode of Battle Guides, featuring Lesandra, the Battle Summoner. And if you're planning to take the Battle Summoner to the battlefield with her little pets, here are a few last-minute tips. Number 1. Manage your familiars. And, you know, this might be repeated over and over again, but this is basically what I want to tell all of you. And it's managing your familiars well. You have a lot of card effects that make summoning familiars easy. Take advantage of that. Number 2. Trade and trade often. Like I said in the Mikhail video, and like I'll say here, you want to keep trading with people because you're like a merchant. You trade everywhere. A lot of your styles have great stun guard values, and your familiars just augment your defenses even more. You have a lot of range, you have a lot of power, you have a lot of stun guard. You are a hit confirmed beast. So trade it. Trade whenever you freaking want. And finally, don't be afraid to shake things up. What do I mean? Shaking things up with Lesandra is really important because you kind of want to be unpredictable with some of your attacks. So that basically means sometimes you have to make oddball plays, like sacrificing that extra lots of life to get that Rune Knight, even though you already dealt 3 damage to get the Salamander. Or maybe doing something along the lines of a really fast attack out of nowhere by anteing the Raven Knight because you want your opponent to get caught off guard. Simply having your familiars scares a lot of opponents. Thank you all so much for watching my video. And I know that this is a new setup and I hope you guys like it. I'm trying to get a real green screen so that I can actually digitally edit this out, and I'm actually trying to get better lighting for all of you, and of course a better microphone. Also note that I've changed where I'm filming, so no more birds! Yes! No more birds. Now, I'd like to say something here. I don't know if any of you know, but the BattleCON War Remastered Kickstarter is still up on Kickstarter and it's nearing its final week. So, if you guys really want, you can still pledge there or increase your pledge. Brad and Level 99 Games are putting out a lot of like crossover characters, a lot of bonus characters for this game. You've probably already seen some of them, right? Anyway, thank you so much for watching this video. If you're interested in anything Level 99 Games or BattleCon related, check the description out below. If you want to talk to me or any of the other BattleCon veterans, check the description out below. Don't forget your special action, and thank you, World of Indines. Thank you, and good night.